A reading from the book of Joshua. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. You are the one who shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant. When you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan." Joshua then said to the Israelites, "Draw near and hear the words of the Lord your God." Joshua said, "By this you shall know that among you is the living God, who without fail will drive out from before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, and Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. The ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is going to pass before you into the Jordan. So now select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. When the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan flowing from above shall be cut off. They shall stand in a single heap." When the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all of its banks throughout the time of the harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap far off at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, while those flowing towards the sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. The people crossed over opposite Jericho. And while all Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priest who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. Here ends the reading. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. This story of the crossing of the Jordan bears many similarities to the crossing of the Red Sea in the book of Exodus. In fact, you can overlay the first several chapters of Exodus along with the first 5 chapters of Joshua and see a great deal of correspondence. There is, at the beginning, a commissioning of Joshua, just like there was a commissioning of God for Moses to become the leader of the people of Israel. And though while Joshua doesn't quite get handed over the stature of Moses and the intimacy that Moses had with God, there is still this sense that God speaks to Joshua directly, and God will speak through Joshua to the people of Israel. There are elaborate preparations before crossing the Jordan, just as there were elaborate preparations on leaving the land of Egypt. The Jordan parts and Israel crosses on dry ground, just as the Red Sea parted and Israel crossed on dry ground there. The Passover is celebrated on the other side of the Jordan, and I think that sort of tries to explicitly link this story again with the story of the Exodus. And then there is a covenant renewal ceremony with circumcision that sort of stands in continuation from the covenant initiation ceremony of the Ten Commandments. Finally, new food is given as the people cross into the wilderness of Sinai, and the flesh pots of Egypt are left behind. So God gives manna each day for the staple of the people of Israel. And now as they cross over into the land of Canaan, that manna stops and is left behind as the flesh pots of Egypt were left behind, and Israel is now presented with the cornucopia of Canaan as their new staple. Given all the similarities, I think what the writers of this story and the book of Joshua are trying to get across is that this is a teaching moment. And maybe one way to find out what sort of the key components of these teaching moments is to look not only at the similarities, which are very glaringly obvious, between the crossing of the Red Sea and the crossing of the Jordan, but to look at some of the differences. And there are 3 that I would like to sort of raise up as worthy of note. And the first one is the character of the journey. In the Exodus, in the crossing of the Red Sea, The people of Israel were running away from slavery and oppression and death. They were always looking over their shoulder. Here at the crossing of the Jordan, the journey is characterized differently. They are no longer a rabble of slaves running away. They are a nation of people looking forward and resolutely stepping forward step by step. And I think that's a very important concept to realize and to embrace. Over the years, I have sat in a number of AA or 12-step meetings. And early on, as I was doing that, it became obvious to me that there were basically two kinds of people who attended those meetings. One kind were people who were literally running away from their addiction. And the other kind of person was a person who was taking life seriously and step by step, resolutely walking into a life of sobriety. And as I listened to the stories of the people who were still possessed by their addiction and running away from it, you could sense the frenetic nature of their lives, how they were running and always looking at over their shoulder for addiction to catch up. And of course, we all know that as you run forward and look back, you're going to run smack into something that is going to knock you flat down. And it's that time that addiction seemed to catch up to them, and those people were much more likely to relapse. On the other hand, the people who were walking intentionally into a life of sobriety had a very different orientation. They were looking forward. They were embracing and accepting themselves and accepting other people around them. They were embracing a new vision for their life. They were embracing new passions for their life. And because of that, they were able day by day to walk into increasing sobriety and stability. I think you can see this even in church history. This Sunday, we are celebrating, in a quiet way, the Reformation. And I think you can ask that same question of the Reformation. What were the Reformers doing? Were they running away from the medieval church, or were they running toward a different vision? And I think you can look at those traditions and those reformers that were really kind of trying to run away from the abuses of the medieval church. And as they did so, inevitably, they kind of recreated what the medieval church was in its form and in its practices, albeit with a kind of Protestant veneer, but they're still stuck in many ways theologically and organizationally back in the Middle Ages. And then there were a group of reformers who began asking the question, what is the church really about? And this is the group of reformers that are clustered in South Germany and Switzerland along the River Rhine, and are really the forebears of our tradition. And instead of trying to run away from what the medieval church was, they began formulating a new vision for what the church could be, and began living into that. And I think that is one reason why we are characteristically different from many of the other churches in town. We have a different orientation. We are looking forward. And as we come to this Sunday, when we go back into our facilities for the first time in several months, and it's really, I'm very conscious that this is a kind of crossing of the Jordan for us, and that we have made elaborate preparations as the people of Israel did to cross the Jordan. And we're doing this with great intentionality. Yet I ask the question in the back of my mind as we do so, are we running away from something, or are we walking toward a different future? The second thing that comes to mind as a difference in this text over the narrative of the Exodus is that the very concept of God is different. For the people of Israel who were leaving Egypt, I think they understood God to be just like the other gods of Egypt, only maybe bigger and badder. God was made manifest in plagues, in a pillar of fire, in parting seas and a pillar of smoke, and thunder and lightning and dark cloud on top of Mount Sinai. And I think with that conception of God, it is understandable that with Moses absent and talking with God about how the covenant is going to come into being and how the people of Israel should reform themselves, in the absence of that leadership, they revert to build the golden calf and revert back to the religious practices and religious forms of worship that were in Egypt in order to appease this God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. It is only after much soul searching and much more experience in the wilderness that they come to realize that the God who has liberated them from Egypt is a very different God from those that were worshipped in Egypt. That God is a God of compassion and loving kindness, of faithfulness, of forgiveness. And so as we come to this crossing, I think one of the key questions is, what God will you worship? If one worships a God who is angry and destructive, one will lead an angry and destructive life and will build an angry and destructive society. If one worships the God of compassion and loving kindness and faithfulness and forgiveness, I think a very different kind of formation for the human spirit and a formation for human community results. And I think this is really the cautionary tale of Joshua as they cross over and they engage in this covenant renewal ceremony with circumcision. I mean, they are intentionally making a different statement. Back in Sinai, with God's ways written on and etched on tablets of stone, there was sort of the understanding that you could take it or leave it. You could refer to them or ignore them, but here at this crossing with the circumcision, they are saying that the ways of God are going to be written on our flesh. And one would expect that they live differently from that point forward. And here's the cautionary tale of Joshua. They don't. And so at the end of the book, I think the book of Joshua sort of recounts this failure of the people of Israel to truly appreciate the nature of God and what that means for their lives and how they organize their lives and deal with other people. And it's a failure. And at the end of the book, when Joshua is at the end of his life and beginning to hand over the mantle of leadership, he asks the poignant question, which God will you serve? Who will you serve? To whom do you belong? And that's a question we'll pick up in 2 weeks. But that's a question we need to ask for ourselves as we move on in our ministry. What kind of God do we worship? And what are those attributes of God that we need to take on and exemplify in our life together, in our lives before the rest of the community? I think the third thing that comes out of this story for me is the concept of memory or amnesia. Certainly in the Exodus story, the liturgy around the Passover was a way to enshrine memory. Here the Passover is celebrated, but something else happens as well. 12 people from each tribe are sent back into the riverbed before the priests cross out of it to pick up 12 large stones. And then on the Canaan side of the River Jordan, they put these stones in a heap as a memorial. And I think what this story is trying to get at is we must retain memory. And as these stories are put together by people in exile looking back and trying to collect the stories of Israel, what they're saying is our stories tell us who we are. Our stories outline our purpose. Our stories reinforce our values. And if we forget the stories, which means if we forget who we are and what our purpose is and what our values are, we become lost as a people. And so we must retain those stories from the past so that we have those stories as tools for navigation to really highlight our identity, our purpose, our values as we live forward into a future that is yet unfolding. And the other function that these stories provided for the people of Israel, especially in exile, as they were putting these stories together, was the notion that the stories that we tell about ourselves give us glimpses as to what our future is going to be. And so, as they told the story of God liberating the people of Israel from Egypt, so that story was told as an act of hope that one day God will liberate them from exile in Babylon. That as God led God's people into a new homeland, into a land of promise, so one day God will liberate us from exile and take us home. The stories that we tell not only solidify our identity, our purpose, our values, but they become the hope that we wish to live out again in the future. What are the stories of our community that outline our identity, our unique reason for being, our purpose, what we are to accomplish as a sacred and blessed community in the midst of the wider community that we live in? What are the values by which we live? What are the things we will do and we won't do because of our values? I think if we begin to tell those stories again and carry them with us, then we will begin to walk into a future with greater confidence. Even as the world is changing around us very rapidly and we become disoriented and confused and anxious, if we carry those stories with us that reinforce our identity, our purpose, our values, we will be able to walk with steadfast purpose. And so these are the three questions that come out of this story for me. What is it that we're walking towards? What is the character of God that we worship, that we must put on ourselves? What are the stories that define us, that give us our identity, that give us our purpose, that shape our values? And I think as we wrestle with these questions, among others, we will traverse not only this landscape of COVID, but also the landscape of our interim journey, to finally figure out where we are going in the next decade or so, and how we are to be God's faithful people, serving each other and serving all others. God bless you all on this Reformation Sunday. Amen.